If you think London was elegant, clean, and royal in the 1600s, you are completely wrong. The real city was filthy, dangerous, overcrowded, and strangely magnificent. The streets were not paved with stone. They were layered with mud, waste, and the remains of whatever the city no longer wanted. The air was not fresh. It was thick with coal smoke, animal dung, and the low rot of a river that was simultaneously London's greatest highway and its largest open sewer. 500,000 people were crammed into a space that had no business holding half that number, living in timber houses so close together that neighbors on opposite sides of a lane could reach out and touch each other's walls. And yet, this city produced Shakespeare. It launched the East India Company. It survived plague, civil war, and a fire that burned for 4 straight days and consumed the heart of everything. It was the most chaotic, most alive, most consequential city in the English-speaking world. This is not the London of portraits and palaces. This is the London of the streets, the docks, the taverns, and the tenements. This is the London they never taught you, raw, real, and impossible to look away from. The city that never stopped growing. When the 1600s opened, London was already straining. The population had doubled in less than 50 years, and it showed. Every parish was overcrowded. Every lane was contested. Every resource, water, firewood, food, and space, was scarcer than it had been a generation before.
The city spread outward from its ancient Roman walls in every direction, swallowing villages that had once been a comfortable distance away. Southwark, across the Thames, had become a world unto itself, home to the theaters, the bear-baiting arenas, the brothels, and the industries too loud or too dangerous or too offensive to be tolerated on the North Bank. Shoreditch and Spitalfields to the northeast were filling with weavers and craftsmen, many of them Huguenot refugees from France, bringing skills that would transform London's textile industry. Westminster, to the west, was the world of the court and the aristocracy, a parallel London that existed at an almost entirely different register of wealth and power. These were not distinct cities. They bled into each other continuously, connected by the river, by the roads, and by the ceaseless movement of people who walked miles every day simply to do their work. London had no public transport. Your feet were your only vehicle unless you were wealthy enough to afford a horse or the shared wherries that ferried passengers across the Thames for a penny. The Thames itself was the city's spine. Everything that mattered either came in by river or went out by river. A morning on the north bank of the Thames in 1620 was an experience of sensory overload so complete it borders on the incomprehensible. The shouts of boatmen, the groan of loading cranes, the slap of water against wood, the calls of merchants in a dozen languages, and beneath it all, the deep, cold, indifferent presence of a river that did not care whether you lived or died. Morning in London, what it actually felt like. Forget everything you think you know about waking up. In London in the 1600s, there was no gradual easing into the day. The city came at you immediately and without mercy. But before sunrise, the water carriers were already moving. These were men and women who hauled wooden tankards and leather buckets from the conduits, the public water sources fed by pipes from springs north of the city, and sold their contents door to door. Water was not safe, and everyone knew it. The conduits were cleaner than the wells, and the wells were cleaner than the Thames. And even the Thames was sometimes preferable to standing water that had been sitting in a butt in someone's yard through a hot summer. Drinking water was a calculated risk every single day. Most Londoners started the morning with ale instead. Not the strong stuff. That was for the evening. Small ale, weak and slightly sour, brewed with enough alcohol to make it safer than water, but not enough to impair a full day's work. Children drank it. The elderly drank it. It was not a luxury. It was a survival strategy dressed up as a breakfast beverage. By the time the church bells marked 6 in the morning, the streets were already packed. Apprentices sweeping storefronts, bakers who had been working since midnight now beginning to sell, street vendors with flat baskets on their heads, calling out whatever they were selling: pies, herbs, pamphlets, matches, coal. The noise was extraordinary. London had no zoning, no separation between residential and commercial, no buffer between the place where you slept and the place where the city did its most aggressive business. You woke up inside the market. You fell asleep inside it. It never fully stopped. The streets, beautiful, broken, and alive. Walking through London in the 1600s required a specific kind of vigilance that modern city dwellers have completely lost. The streets were not flat. They were cambered, raised in the middle and sloping toward the edges so that rain and waste would run into the gutters that ran along each side. The theory was reasonable. The practice was catastrophic. The gutters accumulated everything the city discarded: kitchen waste, human waste, dead animals, broken crockery, spoiled food, the runoff from tanneries and slaughterhouses and dye works. In dry weather, this material hardened
hardened and cracked. In wet weather, it liquefied and spread. In summer, it fermented.
The houses overhead made things worse. London's timber-framed buildings were built to maximize floor space, so each successive story jutted out slightly further than the one below. By the time you reached the third or fourth floor of a typical Cheapside building, the gap between facing houses might be no more than a few feet. This kept rain off the street, which was a mercy. It also meant that whatever was thrown from upper windows, and the practice of throwing waste from windows was common, legally required to be preceded by a warning shout of Gardaloo, and frequently not so preceded, landed very close to whoever was walking below. And yet the streets were also where London's culture lived. The signs hanging above every shop and tavern were a visual encyclopedia of commerce, painted in vivid colors, often with genuine artistry, depicting the trade conducted inside. A blue anchor for a rope maker, a golden fleece for a wool merchant, a half moon for a tavern that had been operating since someone's grandfather's time. These signs were so numerous and so large that they occasionally fell in high winds, killing people below, and the city repeatedly legislated against their size with essentially no effect whatsoever. Cheapside was the commercial heart of it all, a wide street by London standards, lined with goldsmiths and mercers and haberdashers, whose window displays were the closest thing the 17th century had to luxury retail. On a market day, Cheapside was so dense with bodies that movement through it was less like walking and more like being carried by a slow human tide. Pickpockets worked it professionally. Preachers worked the corners. Ballad sellers worked the crowd with the latest printed songs about scandals, executions, and miraculous events from the countryside. London in the 1600s was not a society that believed in equality. It was a society that believed with total conviction that your place in the world was essentially fixed at birth, and that this was not merely practical, but divinely ordained. At the top sat the aristocracy, a tiny group whose wealth was staggering by any measure. A great nobleman might own estates across multiple counties, command a household of hundreds, and exercise a degree of local political power that made him, within his own territory, something very close to a king. In London, the aristocracy maintained townhouses in Westminster, closer to the court, safely upwind of the city's worst smells, and moved through the city in a way designed to minimize actual contact with it. Below them, the merchant class was the engine of London's real economy, and by the 1600s, the most successful merchants were wealthy enough to challenge the aristocracy's social dominance in ways that made the old order deeply uncomfortable. A merchant who had made a fortune in the East India trade might purchase a knighthood, buy a country house, and send his sons to Oxford. The boundary between old money and new money was blurring, and it was blurring fastest in London, which had always been more interested in what you could do than in who your grandfather was. The guilds occupied the middle of this structure with a confidence that came from genuine power. London's livery companies, the merchant tailors, the goldsmiths, the fishmongers, the drapers, were not merely trade associations, they were regulatory bodies with the authority to search premises, confiscate substandard goods, and exclude non-members from practicing their trade within the city. Guild membership meant protection, access to credit networks, welfare in times of illness, and a defined social identity. To be outside the guilds was to be outside the safety net, and in a city with no state welfare system worth the name, that was a genuinely precarious position. Women moved through all of these layers in ways that the legal record systematically undercounts. The law treated a married woman as legally merged with her husband. She could not own property independently, sign contracts, or appear in court in her own name. The reality was considerably more complex. Women ran businesses, managed accounts, negotiated with suppliers, trained apprentices, and in widowhood often became the most effective operators of enterprises their husbands had founded. The gap between what women were permitted to be and what women actually were is one of the defining tensions of the period. It seems like a small thing, a piece of paper, a group of men in a room, but what they were creating was a new kind of institution, a joint stock company with royal authorization to trade in the East Indies, backed by pooled capital from hundreds of investors who shared the profits and the risks. It was, in embryonic form, the template for modern capitalism, and it would make London, over the coming centuries, the financial center of the world. But you did not need to understand high finance to feel what trade was doing to London in the 1600s, you just had to go to the docks. At the legal quays along the north bank of the Thames, the only places where dutiable goods could legally be unloaded, the world arrived in physical form every single day. Bolts of Indian cotton in colors that English weavers could not replicate. Barrels of Virginia tobacco, whose sharp, strange smell drifted for blocks in every direction. Casks of Portuguese wine. Bales of raw silk from the Levant. Ivory, spices, dyes, sugar, still expensive enough to be a luxury, still produced largely by enslaved labor in the Caribbean, a connection that London's merchants were fully aware of and chose with remarkable consistency not to think about. The wealth generated by this trade remade London's physical fabric in real time. New buildings, new streets, new churches. The Royal Exchange, founded in the previous century, had become a genuine financial institution where merchants gathered to do business in the style of the great continental bourses. Credit instruments, bills of exchange, promissory notes circulated through the city, allowing transactions to happen without coin changing hands. London was developing, imperfectly and chaotically, the financial infrastructure of a modern economy. Here is something the textbooks rarely tell you. The people of 17th century London were not passive recipients of the culture handed down to them from above. They were voracious consumers who drove a creative economy of extraordinary vitality. The theater was the center of this. London's playhouses, the Globe, the Fortune, the Red Bull, and a dozen others were the most democratic cultural institutions the city possessed. For a penny, a working Londoner could stand in the yard of the Globe and watch a performance of a new play by one of the most gifted writers in the English language. The repertoire moved fast. A successful play might run for a handful of performances before being replaced by something new. Playwrights were under constant pressure to produce, and they responded by producing work of astonishing range and ambition. Tragedy, comedy, history, romance, satire, all of it aimed at an audience that was equally at home with crude physical comedy and complex philosophical argument. Shakespeare was winding down his career as the century opened, but the theatrical world he had helped build was very much alive. John Webster was writing The Duchess of Malfi. John Johnson was producing his great city comedies, savage satires of London greed and social pretension that his audiences recognized with delight. Thomas Middleton was mapping the moral corruption of the city with a precision that reads 400 years later, like journalism. The printing trade was equally explosive. London's booksellers, concentrated around St. Paul's churchyard, were producing material at a rate that would have been unimaginable to the previous generation. Almanacs, political pamphlets, religious tracts, ballads printed on single sheets and sold for a halfpenny, spreading news, opinion, and gossip to a population whose literacy was growing faster than any official institution could track or control. The printing press had been in England for over a century, but in the 1600s, it became something genuinely dangerous to those in power, a technology that allowed ideas to move faster than authority could suppress them. And then there were the taverns, thousands of them, one licensed establishment for every 100 or so inhabitants by some estimates. The tavern was where London thought out loud, where merchants gathered to share intelligence about markets and shipping, where playwrights argued about plays, where apprentices who had finished their day's work spent their few free hours in conversation that was, by all accounts, sharp, funny, argumentative, and frequently political in ways that the authorities found alarming. For all its energy, London in the 1600s lived under a shadow it could never entirely escape. Catastrophe was not a possibility. It was a recurring fact. Plague arrived with the new century. The outbreak of 1603 killed somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 Londoners, roughly 1 in 8 of the entire population, in a single year. The weekly bills of mortality that the city published became morbid reading material that Londoners studied with the mixture of dread and compulsion you might today apply to a news feed during a crisis. Red crosses painted on doors, the doleful sound of the dead cart moving through streets at night, the flight of everyone who could afford to leave, abandoning the city to those who had no choice but to stay. The cause was not understood. Miasma theory, the belief that disease arose from bad air, from the very stench that London generated so abundantly, was the dominant explanation. It was wrong, but it was not entirely without logic. The neighborhoods where plague hit hardest were the poorest and the most overcrowded, the places with the worst sanitation and the highest concentrations of the rats and fleas that actually carried Yersinia pestis. The connection between poverty, filth, and disease was real, even if the mechanism was misidentified. Plague returned in 1625, and again with terrible finality in 1665, when it killed perhaps 100,000 Londoners before burning itself out. Then came the Civil War. From 1642 onward, England tore itself apart over questions of religion, constitutional authority, and the limits of royal power that
that had been building toward explosion for decades. London was the Parliament's city, commercially minded, Puritan-leaning in large sections, deeply suspicious of a king who seemed to believe that his divine right to rule superseded any obligation to consult the people he was ruling. Londoners built defensive earthworks around their city. They funded armies. They cheered parliamentary victories and endured parliamentary failures. And on a cold January morning in 1649, they gathered at Whitehall to watch Charles I walk out onto a scaffold and lose his head, an event so shocking, so without precedent in English history, that even many of those who had opposed the king were shaken to their foundations. The Great Fire came in 1666, at the tail end of our century. It started in a bakery on Pudding Lane and burned for 4 days, consuming 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, and the old medieval St. Paul's Cathedral. 70,000 people were left homeless. The physical heart of the city that had existed for 600 years was gone. And yet, London rebuilt. Within decades, Christopher Wren had designed a new St. Paul's and 52 new city churches. The streets were marginally wider, the buildings marginally less flammable, and the city that emerged from the ashes was, in its bones, recognizably the beginning of the London that exists today. By 1700, London was a different city than it had been 100 years before. The fire had given it a new face. The Civil War had given it a new political identity. A reminder, written in the king's own blood, that power had limits, that rulers were accountable, that the relationship between the crown and the people was a negotiation rather than a dictation. The expansion of trade had made it one of the wealthiest and most connected cities in the world.
But strip away the politics and the economics and the great events, and what you find underneath is something simpler and more enduring. The lives of ordinary people who navigated an extraordinary world with the tools they had. The apprentice who rose before dawn every morning for 7 years, learning a trade in a city that offered no guarantees and made no apologies. The merchant's wife who ran the household accounts with a precision her husband publicly took credit for. The dock worker who handled goods from 4 continents without ever traveling more than 20 miles from the street where he was born. The child growing up in a Southwark tenement who somehow found, in a city that offered very little tenderness, enough wonder to keep going. Their world was harder than ours in almost every measurable way. Shorter lives, more pain, less safety, less certainty. The city they lived in demanded everything from them and offered, in return, the particular vitality that comes from being alive in a place where everything is happening at once, where the future is being invented on the same street where the past refuses to die. London in the 1600s was not elegant, it was not clean, it was not safe, but it was ferociously, unapologetically alive. And that, more than any plague or fire or revolution, is what it still has to teach us. The next time you walk through the city of London, look down at the ground beneath your feet. The medieval street plan is still there, hidden under centuries of tarmac and concrete. The same lanes, the same angles, the same city, rearranged but not erased. They built something that lasted. In a century that tried its hardest to destroy everything, that is no small thing.